Hello, my name is Kathryn Sturrock and I'm back here at Katy Designs headquarters to talk you through how to use some of the sugar button moulds. We're going to be working with the Fairy today. Now she's one of the more detailed moulds, one of the character moulds and one of the originals, and this one is so worth spending a little bit more time on. But I'm going to show you two methods of working with it. We're going to start with the easiest and then we're going to move up a stage. So as normal, when you work with the moulds, it's best just to take a little bit of corn flour and just dust out the mould with the corn flour first, just to make sure if there's any excess moisture in there that you've got that taken away. The reason we do this is because the clay will stick if there is any moisture in that mould. So I'm just going to tap out any excess and then we're going to work with the figure as a whole. Now this is the easiest way, so if you're new to the moulds I would suggest starting in this way. I'm going to take some of the white hearty clay. Now this has been taken straight from the pack. You'll find when you first take it from the pack, if you give it a little bit of a stretch just to release all the moisture in there, it will become a little bit more pliable. Now I do find that it can be too wet if you take it straight from the pack, so I normally just let it sit in the air just for 5-10 minutes and then go back to it. I'll talk through why I do that as we go through the demo. Now because this is white clay and we're making a character, the best tip that I can give everybody is don't try and paint in the skin tone. You will find that difficult. I have so many people tell me that they get fantastic results from the moulds, but then when they come to paint, it's letting them down. The reason is because the skin tone is the very hardest thing to get right. So my best tip of all is to pre-colour that clay into the skin tone colour. Now there are different ways you can do that. You can use one of the hearty coloured clays. Now if you're going to go with the red, then take the tiniest bit. If you want a little bit more control, I do find that using a gel food colouring is very good. So I've just got some orange here, and I would say rather than squeezing the tube, just pick a little bit of colour up onto a cocktail stick and then apply that to the clay. Because gel food colouring is very highly concentrated, it only takes a very small amount, and it's just like working the colour into a fondant. Now I know this is still going to be a little bit too dark, but I just want you to be able to see the colour so you can see how easy it is actually to mix that. And it's as simple as that. So you've got a lovely skin tone there. Obviously if you want to do a darker skin tone, you can add different colours in there, so you can make the skin whatever colour you prefer. So that one there is probably, as it dries, it does dry a little bit darker. I do find that with the clay. So I wouldn't want to go any darker than that. Now I've got some that's been drying out that I mixed earlier. And it is very pale, but there is definitely colour in there. So what we're going to do is take some of the clay. Now this has been left out in the air for probably about 15 minutes now as I've been preparing for the demo. But I can feel that that is a really good texture and consistency for the clay. The reason I don't take the clay straight from the pack is it is too wet, and you will find that if the clay is too wet, when you flex the mould, the clay will bend and stretch with the mould rather than popping upwards. So if you do find that happens, it is simply that the clay is too wet. So don't panic, don't think you're doing anything wrong, just let the clay dry a little bit more. Now I do find it easiest with the character moulds to roll out a sausage of clay and then start to feed down the centre and work outwards. Now this is just to do the one colour and then we can paint the detail in. This is the first method. I'm going to show you more than one method, but this is definitely the easiest way of doing it. So if you're new to the sugar button moulds, especially the characters, I would suggest that you start in this way. Now when we come to the feet with the fairy itself, they are quite intricate. We've even got little tiny toes on there. So I find for the feet, if you roll out a sausage of clay and feed that down into the foot so you can get right into the bottom, it may help. Sometimes if you don't get the clay pushed down quite far enough, you'll find that you don't pick up every little bit of detail. Usually the moulds aren't so deep as this one. This is a very deep detail mould. They do vary, so maybe some of the animals or something like that have less detail in them, and you won't need to worry about putting the clay in different pieces. But I would definitely suggest with the fairy, feed those little feet in separately to make sure you get the clay where you want it. So I'm just going to continue to push down with fingertips. And remember, I've already coloured this to the skin tone, so we can paint in anything else, but the arms and the face and the legs won't have to be painted at all, so you're going to get the best results possible. When you think you've filled that up nice and evenly across the depth or level with the rim of the mould, you can go over the top with a rolling pin. I would suggest this is really important with the characters because you do have a lot of detail and you want to pick up all that detail. Now at this stage, if you find you've got any excess clay, you can remove it. And also if you find there's any areas maybe where the clay is not quite thick enough, I'm just going to add a little bit more there actually to the wing. You can top up over the top. It doesn't matter that you're applying that in a separate piece. And again, just give that a really nice roll over with the rolling pin, and then we're going to tidy it all up. So you can see here, I just point with the stick, you can see little areas where it looks a little bit untidy. So just by working around the edge with a fingertip, you can clean that all up. As I say, it's because you've got too much clay in there, you can remove it just by scraping away. Now you can notice a little post that shows through the legs there. That's important, that's the little gap. So you can have that showing, you don't need to cover it up. And just continue to work round. You don't really notice the arms at this stage because they're covered by the wings, but they will be more visible as we take the clay from the mould. So we've cleaned that up nicely now, and we're ready to flex the mould and take the clay out. Now all the sugar button moulds have this lovely outer rim, and that does help you flex. So you can see there, as I'm just pulling away, how that is starting to come away nice and cleanly. This is where the clay was wet. You wouldn't find that, it would just be bending, it wouldn't be popping upwards. Now a slight sticking area would be the feet. That's the trickiest part because of the shape of the feet. So if you need to give it a helping hand, just ease those out nice and steadily. Now another tip I can give you is try not to put your finger underneath and press where the face is, because you can distort the face a little bit. Now as I've turned that up, you'll notice that the characters just dropped out, and that is because the clay is such a consistency that it's not stuck at all, and it's literally just dropped out of the mould when I flexed it. And you can see we've got every bit of detail there. We've got the toes, we've got the creases in the legs, we've got the veins on the leaves and all the little flowers and the hair strands, and everything is all perfectly there. So now we're ready to move on to the next stage. You can leave that to dry. Being air drying clay, it is literally just drying in the air. So I would suggest put that on a piece of kitchen towel or maybe a cooling rack to allow the air to circulate underneath it. But you want to allow that to dry nice, perfectly dry before you use it on your projects or begin to paint. So I've got a series of little characters that I've made earlier. And so we've done these in exactly the same way. We've got the air dry clay pre-coloured to the skin tone, and it has slightly darkened as it's dried, which is fine. And then we've got a couple more that I've been working with the paint. So I'm going to talk you now through decorating those and putting the colour in. So very easy to paint. I would suggest using an acrylic paint. I'm using a chalk paint. I do like the matte look. So I tend to use a chalk paint. They're very quick to dry, but it is a type of acrylic. It's water-based. So I'm just going to give that bottle a shake and then grab a paintbrush, and I'm just going to paint in a little bit of detail. I'm not going to do the whole thing because obviously the colours are your choice, but just by painting directly onto the clay, you can apply the colour wherever you want it. Now because the clay is porous, you will find that the colour will soak in a little bit, so if you want to give a second coat, that will help. And there is another trick that I can offer as well. Now I haven't actually done it on this character. Sometimes I do and sometimes I don't, because the second coat will cover the clay perfectly. But if you wanted to water down some PVA glue, just 1 part glue, 1 part water, and paint the whole character with that, it will seal the clay and it gives it more of a satin look. It doesn't give it a gloss as such, but it will just give more of a satin look, which can look quite nice on the skin tone and as a finish. You can likewise paint that on separately afterwards. So you can paint first and then put the glaze on. But as I say, it's an option. It's not a necessity. It is entirely up to you. So I would say maybe just make 1 or 2 little characters and experiment. You know, experiment with the glazes, experiment with the paints. You can use things like pro markers. You can use all sorts of different pens and alcohol pens for colouring. Felt tip pens if you're letting the children get involved. You know, so many different ways of colouring. The edible food paints work perfectly on the clay as well, as do the powders. So, you know, you've got so many different products out there that you may already have in your crafty stash that you can work with. So I'm just painting in some of the skirt there, but you can see how that's already starting to change the look of the character. So I would let that dry perfectly and obviously continue to paint with all the different colours until you're happy with the design. And then we'll bring in this one because I've painted her ready. Actually, she's the finished one. We're going to bring in this one because there's some little tricks that I'm going to show you that will make a difference with it. I've painted the hair, I've painted the flowers, the wings and the dress. You can see I've not had to put any paint at all on that pre-mixed clay colour, so you're getting the best finish possible for the skin tone. But we can accentuate the face a little bit just by using one of my tricks with the blusher. Now this is it's just a very cheap blusher. I think it cost me about £1, so you know you can pick these up, but go for one of them that's matte rather than a mica finish. You don't want the shimmery blushes, they don't look the same. Or you can use an artist's chalk, or maybe if you've got pan pastels or something like that, you can use any sort of crafter's chalks. And I'm just going to give little rosy cheeks. So it's very subtle. So I do tend to sort of pick a bit of colour up and take it to the back of my hand just to make sure it's not too deep, and then just work that little bit of colour onto the cheeks, and it does make a difference. You could add a little bit of blush onto the arms and legs if you want as well, but to be honest with you, you don't really need to. You can just leave them as long as you've pre-mixed that skin tone first. So that's trick number 1, which I always like to do. And trick number 2 is the eyes. Now you can see I've already got some black paint in the eyes there, and what I've done to create that is just use one of these nail art tools. They're like little ball tools, little embossing tools. You normally pick these up, you tend to get 4 or 5 in a pack, and they're usually double-ended, so you get the different size balls. They're really, really useful. I find these much better than using a paintbrush, because with a paintbrush, if you haven't got a steady hand or the bristles are too long, you're not going to get a very nice round eye. You're going to get something that's a little bit squiffy. So I'm just choosing a very small ball tool, and I'm picking up a little bit of paint. I tend to shake the bottle and pick it up from the lid so that you've just got the bowl covered with the paint there, and then just holding it directly above, I'm just going to dot that into the eye. You could, if you prefer, use a seed bead, but if you're going to use a seed bead, then place that in the clay when it's wet, and then as the clay dries, it tends to shrink just a little bit, so it will grip that little eye, or you can pop a tiny bit of glue underneath. If you are using glue, use the tiniest amount, because the PVA glue makes the clay go very sticky. So once you've got the black into the eyes there, you can highlight them just with a little white dot. And my preferred tool for this would be a cocktail stick, as long as it's got a very, very sharp point to it. Make sure it's not a blunt one, because it will just be too wide. And just dip that into the paint. Or you could use a pokey tool, as long as it's got a nice sharp point, or even a sewing needle. Rather than one of the really fine ones, go for a slightly thicker one, and you could use that. You just want something with a very fine point to it, and something that's sturdy. Again, you wouldn't be able to do this with a paintbrush without making a mess, because it's just too flexible. And I'm literally just taking a dot to each eye. If I bring in one that I did earlier, hopefully you can see there, it just highlights the eye, and it actually makes her look as though she's looking at you. It brings her face to life, and it gives her a little glint in her eye. You can decide where to put those. I tend to put them around about the 2 o'clock mark, but because the eye is very small, it's a little bit difficult for you to really gauge where 2 o'clock would be. I tend not to go directly into the centre or right at the bottom. I tend to go a little bit higher to the top. But experiment with that, because the different looks will give you different features. And you will find that with the moulds, and this is what I love about how Katy sort of managed to capture these characters, although you've got one character, every time that you make one, they're going to look different, depending on how you colour them, how you do the eyes, extra features and things like that, you know, because you can't add additions to these. So I'll show you that on the next part of the demo, because we're going to give you maybe what we call a step up from the painting, where we're going to build up the character in the different colour clays to save you having to do the majority of the work with paint. For the second part of the demo, I'm going to show you how to build up the colours separately. For me, this works and makes the finished look a little bit more professional in a sense, especially if you're not particularly good at painting. Now, I've brought in one of the characters here that we did do before. This is a painted version, so if you're happy to do it that way, that's fantastic, but it is nice to show both versions. Now, it's useful to keep a finished character at the side of you, particularly so that you can see how the colours are going to lie. If you look at the mould itself, it's highly detailed, and there are certain areas that when the character is taken out, you can see are on the top. So for instance, you would look at the flowers and the hair. They're the pieces that stand out above anything else, and they're the areas that need to be filled first with the mould. So that will become more clear as I go through the demo. So we're going to start again by mixing some clay colours, and I've already mixed these in advance because we've talked about how to mix the various different shades. And I've mixed a yellow colour. This is the white hearty clay with some of the yellow mixed into it, just the smallest amount because it's a very highly concentrated colour. Just to take the brassness of the yellow, just to make it a little bit of a duller shade, I've put the tiniest bit of brown in there as well, but the colour is entirely up to you. Now, as I go through the demo, I'm going to try and give you some hints and tips of how to make this much easier to work with. And if you do find any areas that are a little bit tricky, there are ways around it. You don't have to worry about missing certain things out. We can always go back and retouch those. That will become clear on the first part of the demo, in fact, because I'm going to start with the hair. Now, you'll notice on the finished item, we've got the two little flowers in the hair. I'm going to suggest that you leave those out. Just ignore them to start with and fill in the area of the hair totally with one colour. So I've mixed the yellow colour in advance, and what I'm going to do, I'm just going to roll a piece out and start to push into the main area of the hair. Now, she has two little pigtails on top of her head, and there are some strands of hair that form a fringe. And I'm going to purposely miss out one or two little strands just to show you how any tricky areas can be filled in afterwards, or you can go back and touch up any areas that aren't quite complete. So I'm using separate pieces of clay just to push into the area of the hair to fill in that main body of hair there. So I'm taking it to the edge. You can slope up the clay away from the face if you like. That actually helps because you don't want to overfill the area. If you do that, when you put the other colour on top, you may get the two colours bleeding together a little bit. So just by sloping away, and again, I'm using my metal tool, but you could use a plastic resin tool or maybe a ball tool or the end of a paintbrush, or just find something in your craft box that will work. Now, there are some little tendrils of hair, I'll just bring in the finished one again, that run down the side of the head. I'm actually going to miss those out because it's easy to put those in afterwards. So I'm going to leave it there with the yellow colour. I think we've got enough in, and we can proceed with one of the other colours now. So I'll turn the mould so it's face onto me so you can see what I'm doing with the dress, because that's the next area. And again, there are little ways you can cheat. Difficult areas to fill with the colour would be the straps on the dress, so you can ignore those as well. It is possible to fill them in, but for the first go I would definitely say avoid them, and then as you progress, then you can you get more confident and you can practice, and you will be able to fill all areas in there. So I'm using a pale green that I've mixed again with the white hearty and some of the green hearty clay, and I'm just going to use my tool to shape just at the top of the neckline of the dress, just avoiding those straps. As I say, I can fill those in afterwards. that's a very easy area to work with, really. The only other bit you've got to watch out for is the bottom of the dress where the legs are. You've got a leaf that sits, well, it's a leaf which forms part of the dress, which sits right in the centre. So I'm just pulling the clay away from the leg area just so you can see the point of that leaf. Again, better to underfill slightly rather than overfill. We can always top this up as we go through the demo, but I want a nice clean area for those legs to go in. We're actually going to use 4 different colours. We've got 2 in, and now I'm going to go back to the skin tone colour that I mixed earlier. This is exactly the same clay as I worked with on the first part of the demo with the character that we painted. Now, another little tip that I can give you, whenever you've got a face, don't overwork the clay into the mould. By that I mean don't keep squishing it backwards and forwards too much, because you can distort the features a little bit. So I find if I roll a ball of clay, so it's got a nice smooth surface, and just drop that inside, you can then push that in position from there without overworking it. Now I have just gone over the top of the dress because that's where the neckline is, and I'm going to add some more clay into the arms. And once again, it doesn't matter if you join the clay, you don't have to go with one lump, you can actually join different pieces. Again, look at the shape that you're working with. So for the arms, I've rolled out little sausage shapes so they fit nicely within that area. It's much easier to get the shape pretty much right rather than going in with a lump of clay and then trying to remove the excess. Same again with the other arm. Now you can go over the top of each colour now. This is going to be the back, and you're going to stick this to a project. So don't worry about it looking a little bit untidy on the back. As long as you've got the colours in the right place down at the bottom of the mould, that is what you're looking for. We can tidy those arms up again in a little while. I want to move on to the feet. And again, we've got those little tiny toes in there. The detail is there, and you want to make sure that you get the clay right down into the mould. So by rolling a little sausage shape and feeding it in, you're going to get that pushed down quite easily. Same again with the other foot. And again, I can overlap the colours on the back of the character now. Use fingertips just to push those down to make sure you've got them nicely down to pick up any detail. And we're going to go over the top with a rolling pin in a minute. But I want to make sure that we've got a nice clean area to put the wings in, because they're the last pieces of the character to build. So again, if you need to use a tool, just pull away from the edge. There's a clear line between the edge of the arm and the wing. So just pull away slightly. Again, you can slope the clay a little bit if you prefer, just to keep it away from the edge of the wing, and then go with the white of the wing. You could use a little bit of blue, or if you don't want white, you could use blue and then maybe add some glitter afterwards, just to give it a little bit of sparkle. So I've just got a small amount of the white clay. The wing itself is the finest area of this mould. So this is where, if the clay was too wet, when you flex the mould, you may find that you've got a problem. If you do have a problem of any sort, that will be the reason. It's because the clay is too wet. So it's very easy to remedy. Just take the clay out of the mould, or you can leave it sat in there in the air to dry a little bit. But once that's dried off, you can then find that when you flex the mould, it will release a lot easier. So now we've got all the colours in there. It does look untidy from the back, but don't worry about it at all. We're not going to see that when this is stuck down onto our project. I would always suggest with the characters using a rolling pin. You can press down onto the surface around this outer lip of the mould. It's very sturdy, you're not going to damage it at all. Just be a little bit more careful where the head is, because if you over roll you might distort the features a little bit. So I'm just pressing down with a rolling pin there to make sure it's compacted. And if you see any areas that need topping up, so maybe a little bit more on the hair, we can do that at this point now. I think we'll be all right to go with that. So I'm just going to then work around the edge with a fingertip just to pull away and give that clean outline. Any little tatty areas that you may miss, you can trim away with scissors, but it does help to do this at this point. And then we're ready to release the clay from the mould. So by using the outer lip again, you can see just by flexing that, you can see how cleanly that's actually coming away. Try and avoid pushing where the face area is, because again, you may just distort the features a little bit. So just try and work around the outer lip. This again is the area where if the clay was a little bit too wet, you may find the wings would be stretching or bending with the mould. It is simply the clay. So don't think you've done anything wrong at all. I'm just going to give this a little helping hand out where the feet are, just because of the shape of them. And there you can see we've got our little fairy with all the features and all the detail perfectly in place. So now I'm going to show you how we can remedy these areas that we've left out. So the hair, the straps on the dress, and then once we've done that, I'm going to show you how you can adapt it and change it into a fairy with maybe a different hairstyle. Just by changing colours and the features on the face a little bit, you can make each character look different. So for the straps on the dress, you could either roll out just a very thin sausage of clay and lay it in place, or as I'm doing here, you can roll out just a thin piece of clay, take a pair of scissors and just snip into that. So I just want 2 little straps. I do find scissors can be easier than using a craft knife because it tends to drag the clay a little bit if you've got a knife. So I'm just going to use a cocktail stick as a tool, in fact, for this. I also find that works well as a knife just to take away any excess on the length. So I can pick that up and just lay that over the top of where the strap should be. And we'll do the same at the other side as well. So I'm just going to break away the clay that I don't need and pick up with a cocktail stick. You'll find that the clay actually sticks quite well to the cocktail stick just for placing. So there, the straps are now in place, and it's much easier to do it that way than trying to get those little bits of clay into the mould. And then for the hair, I'll bring back in the one that we painted up. You can see the little tendrils of hair down the side of the face there. So to do that, rather than trying to get those awkward bits into the mould, use the fingertip again just to roll out some very thin strips. Probably a cocktail stick again is the best tool for this, rather than trying to pick up with something else. And then you can just push into place the piece of clay and just roll that around and apply that where necessary. So I'm just going with 2 little fine pieces. And then I'm going to show you how we can change the hairstyle as a whole. So there, I'm just using that cocktail stick just to curl around those 2 little bits of clay, filling in the gaps. And if you've missed anything or you need to go with a second layer, you can add another little strip there. So that would complete the fairy with all the colours and all the elements in place, except for the flowers, which I would suggest you could paint those in. They're just such little small areas, and you can use beads maybe in the centre of a flower or some pearl drops or something like that. And then we're going to paint the eyes in as well. But before I do that, I'm just going to show you how to change the hairstyle completely. And this is what I like about the moulds. Because it's a mould, you may think, well, everything's going to look exactly the same. It really doesn't have to. Just by little tricks, you can change things around. So again, I'm rolling out with the fingertips some thin strands of clay. You can make these really quite thin. And normally I use 2 or 3 strands at a time to build up the hair. So we'll start with 2, and if we need any extra, we can overlay a 3rd strand. So just again using a cocktail stick to break that off. Just take that one a little bit thinner. And I'm going to join those together at the top. You can feel now, because the clay is drying more, it becomes more rubbery, which can actually help because it's a little bit firmer to work with as well, so you can handle it easily. And then I'm going to join that just at the back of the fairy's ear. You can use a cocktail stick or some other tool just to push it into place to make sure it's sticking well. And then I'm going to just guide that round, just curling it as I go. So she's now getting some long hair. So we've done one side. As I say, we can build that up and make a few extra strands if we like, but I think actually when the other side's on there to match, it will look okay. So again, we'll just roll out a couple of strands and repeat at the other side. So join at the top. And use a tool or a cocktail stick just to place the top of the strands together, and then start to guide that round and break off anything that you don't actually need. So you could actually remove the pigtails at the top and change the hairstyle there as well, but I actually think she looks quite cute to keep those and have the extra long hair as well. At that stage, we're just ready for the extra decoration and of course the finishing off of the face. So I'm going to bring one in that I made earlier. This one's been drying off a little bit. Now for the eyes, if you wanted to use a seed bead, you could actually place those now while the clay is wet. The clay does tend to shrink a little bit as it dries, and that will help grip that and keep it in place. But you could add a very small, and I mean a very small amount of PVA just to keep that in place as well. So I'm going to go back to my embossing tool. So I'm using one of the small ball tools that I've got. Again, these are nail art tools. And just by dipping into the paint, getting a small amount of paint on the end of there, we can then just dot into each of the eye sockets. And that just gives you that control because the tool is nice and rigid. So once you've done that, you can then go with a little white dot in the eye. If I bring in one that we made earlier, again use the end of a cocktail stick or maybe a pokey tool, or a needle would work as well. Just something with a very fine tip so that you can dip in and put that little white highlight as we did earlier on the previous demonstration with the single colour clay. And don't forget, it is worth putting those blusher cheeks on as well. So just a little bit of powder onto each cheek, just warms up the face. And when she's totally dry, I could add some PVA glue to the wings and glitter her up and paint in the flower, a little bead in the middle or some pearl drops. And again, you can use things like ink into the skirt there, just to highlight the veins on the skirt. That would be another little trick. But really, you know, this is your design, it's your fairy. You can decorate exactly as you please. So I've just gone to bring in a couple of the finished samples, just as a reminder of a couple of ideas of what you can do. So here we've just got an MDF disc with one of the little fairies on there. I've teamed her with one of the owls from the owl mould, which also comes with the branch and the leaves, and the bird from the birdhouse. So think about the other sugar button moulds that you've already got or that are available with Katy Sue, and think about how you can mix those together. Another good idea is to mould the clay around a jar. So here we've got, it's just a recycled jar. I'm just going to turn it this way as well so you can see it from the other angle. So we've got the fairy there, and then I've built some toadstools and some grass around the edge of the jar. Now, if you are going to work with a glass jar or maybe a mug or something like that, something that's made of pot or glass, you can actually mould the characters around those items. So when the clay is wet, if it was air dry clay, just a little bit of PVA glue on the back and glue it into place and allow it to dry around that jar so that it works to the shape of it. This one's actually been done with polymer clay. So I've moulded it to the jar and then baked it in the oven. Polymer clay normally just takes half an hour. It's just an oven baked clay that you can use at home in any oven that you've already got. And the shape of it, again, will just work with the utensil underneath. So they're a great project to make. You can fill those with sweets or gifts, and it's just another idea of how to work with the moulds.